Now, as Bob mentioned, you might be wondering, what's a retired Coast Guard, U.S. Coast Guard Admiral, doing speaking at the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Rome during World War II? For many assume the U.S. Coast Guard is a domestic organization that is limited to guarding the coast. As a recently retired member of the U.S. Coast Guard, having served for over 30 years, I would often hear this comment and receive questions while performing Coast Guard missions around the globe. So I'm honored to participate in this conference and share a little history of the U.S. Coast Guard's role as an element of Allied naval forces in the Liberation of Rome campaign. I'm also very excited to learn more about the many perspectives of the Italian campaign. I'll be very upfront and share that I am not a historian. I'm a retired officer, an operations specialist, although I have a passion for history and linkage to Italy. My great-grandfather had come over to the United States, and my grandfather had served in Patton's army during the liberation of Italy. So, next slide, please. At the time, next slide, please. At the time of World War II, the U.S. Coast Guard was the smallest of the U.S. Armed Forces. And there's a key distinction there. Many countries view their Coast Guard as a domestic organization that is not aligned with the armed services, maybe civil in nature, organized as a maritime police force within the United States. And this evolved from the 1700s. Given our customs authorities, the U.S. Coast Guard is an element of the armed forces, although we're not always aligned within the Department of Defense. Most times we're not within the Department of Defense. However, we can shift, as we did in World War II, to become a member of the Joint Force, being organizationally realigned under the Department of the Navy. So as I highlight here, this happened in November of 1941, and it lasted until January 1st in 1946, where the U.S. Coast Guard was moved into the Department of the Navy, and so operated, performed, can you shift to the next slide, please? Performed all their traditional domestic missions within the states, while also supporting the United States Navy missions around the globe, and in this case, serving in both the European theater and also in the Pacific theater. So while we remained in the Navy, we performed all traditional missions, which include protecting the ports, patrolling coasts to prevent sabotage and clandestine threats, as well as protecting the handling, loading, and shipment of much-needed war supplies that flowed from the United States to support the Allies in Europe. Next slide, please. There was a rapid expansion to perform these missions, and so with the additional missions, there was a need to rapidly grow the Coast Guard. At the beginning of the war, there were just over 29,000 personnel, mainly service members, active duty members in uniform, although we had some civilians also. That swelled to over 175,000 regular and reservists filling the ranks of the Coast Guard by 1944. In addition to those numbers, we had over 51,000 temporary reservists. Many of them were volunteers that joined, wanted to serve their country, and the Coast Guard provided that opportunity and needed their support. So there was an entire team, as many countries responded and grew their forces to respond to the threats posed by World War II. The Coast Guard was certainly part of that. Next slide, please. So our operational capabilities also rapidly evolved. In this case, I highlight aviation was at the forefront of Coast Guard missions domestically, as well as supporting on-water, underwater, and air missions, taking advantage of all new and evolving capabilities. Next slide, please. This included the many capabilities were performed stateside and then projected out into the transit zones of the Atlantic, and those continued into the combat zones in the Mediterranean. Next, please. This included the traditional missions for the U.S. Coast Guard, one of which are most famous has always been rescues at sea, search and rescue missions. So whether it was near the U.S. coastline, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, or amidst the intense battles in the Mediterranean theater, search and rescue operations at sea remained a top priority mission for Coast Guard personnel throughout World War II. And I would highlight that remains the same. That is a top priority mission Coast Guard men and women perform around the globe. Next slide, please. So it's noteworthy that the Coast Guard participated in every amphibious operation by United States military forces during World War II. During the early stages of the war, the major effort of the U.S. Coast Guard at sea was in the Atlantic, beginning with the assignment of large cutters to the Naval Task Force in intensive escort of convoy duties and anti-submarine combat in the landings in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and then France, with Coast Guard lending invaluable service to both the Army, the Navy, and the Joint Force. Next slide, please. And as another example of how Coast Guard expanded while adapting to the greater responsibilities during World War II, at the start of the war, the Coast Guard had 168 vessels that were 100 feet or over in length. By 1943, the total Coast Guard fleet comprised 802 vessels that were over 65 feet in length, plus almost 8,000 smaller boats. In addition, both the U.S. Army and Navy needed Coast Guard personnel to man many of their vessels. In all, 351 Navy vessels and 288 Army craft were manned by Coast Guard men and reservists. So the role performed by Coast Guard personnel was often blurred or overshadowed by its roles and its missions, the variety of which were labeled as Coast Guard or labeled as Navy or Army missions on their vessels, on their boats, across a wide variety of locations. When it came to landing operations, the Coast Guard was, as highlighted in the slide, the Coast Guard is recognized as experts operating and maintaining and salvaging landing craft. Next slide, please. So as elegantly articulated by Professor Maria Gabriella, many know the Allies landed in Normandy, but lesser known but equally important, as we've discussed last night and this morning, were the Allied landings in Italy here. The professor spoke eloquently about Operation Shingle, which was critically important to the liberation of Rome. And I will just touch on that very briefly, given her remarks. Next slide, please. Dubbed Shingle, the operation was scheduled and the landings completed on schedule. Behind the scenes, although the Naval Task Force was supporting the landings. Next slide. The joint U.S. and Royal Navy Task Force 81, which was commanded by Rear Admiral Frank Lowry, U.S. Navy, provided the naval forces to support the landings. The task force, consisting of 2 headquarters ships, 2 submarines, 4 cruisers, 28 destroyers, 103 minor warships and other vessels, and 241 landing ships and craft steamed from Naples on the 21st. Notwithstanding the rehearsals a few days earlier, D-Day went remarkably smoothly, as the professor noted, aided by the calm seas. By the end of the day, and I'm very happy my statistics and research aligned with the professors, over 36,000 men, 3,000 vehicles, and the initial stockpile of supplies 90% of the initial assault load had been delivered to the Anzio beachhead with light casualties. Next slide, please. The Task Force 81s continued to offload the troops and supplies for the 6th Corps as the beachhead was consolidated. Although caught off guard during the first 24 hours of the operation, the Germans quickly concentrated troops in the region and stepped up air attacks of the Anzio beachhead. However, the Luftwaffe proved unable to stop the task force from delivering troops and supplies into the Anzio beachhead. Next slide, please. The Naval Task Force mission at Anzio changed, however, as we've heard and saw with the film last night, once the focus of the operation shifted to the fighting that raged around the beachhead. Much of the fighting took place beyond the range of the naval weapons, the naval guns, so maintaining a logistical lifeline became the critical role for the Allied naval forces to support the intense fighting which happened over the successive months, which we've heard such a detailed description of, all beyond or at the outer reaches of the beachhead. So next slide, please. So I'd like, as Bob mentioned, I'd like to talk of one lesser known Coast Guard mission that evolved once the conflict had moved up into the Italian mainland and then north. It began with the Allied occupation of Sicily, and it became immediately desirable to restore the Italians' fishing industry. So one lesser-known initiative that engaged Coast Guard personnel was their involvement in supporting efforts to restore the Italian fisheries industry as the combat moved north along the Italian mainland and as the Allies established control. Organizationally, a U.S. Coast Guard detachment of fisheries experts were assigned to the Fisheries Division of the Agriculture Subcommission of the Allied Control Commission. The Allied Control Commission was an integrated British-American body set up in September 1943 under the Supreme Allied Commander to enforce the Italian armistice and to act as the body through which the Allied powers conducted business with the Italian government. The commission took over for the military government when it was absorbed by the Allied military government of the occupied territories in January 1944. Next slide, please. As I've experienced during my visits to Italy, fish forms an incredibly important part of the Italian diet, and I've had the pleasure to personally experience this. As a Coast Guard mission, and the Coast Guard has a domestic mission of regulating and enforcing fisheries regulations. Personnel were detached to support this. It was clearly an extension of our peacetime work as a maritime law enforcement agency working with the U.S. fishing industry. In Sicily, their efforts were so successful that in the assigned territory, fishing activities were restored to approximately 75% of the normal peacetime production despite material and manpower shortages. Next slide, please. Their mission proceeded in two phases. First, they found that the newly established Allied security regulations were blanket prohibitions against any Italian watercraft whatsoever from operating at sea. So their immediate job was to draft a framework of regulations that would meet the requirements of the security plans and still permit the freest possible operation of the Italian fishing boats. Their goal was to draft a set of new regulations for the Italian fishing industry that would remain as Italian governance was restored under Italian fisheries enforcement agencies. By fitting the Italian fishing regulations into the pre-existing security framework and by ensuring that their original promulgation by local Italian authorities were prescribed, the newly established regulations were being enforced by the new Italian government. The second phase of the mission for these fisheries experts was to outreach and engage with the Italian fishermen, port officials, the fish wholesalers, and others to promote awareness, understanding, and the rehabilitation of the industry in coordination with local Italian Coast Guard authorities. Next slide, please. In my final slide, this was from the U.S. Coast Guard's perspective, viewed as a win-win effort, as the restoration of the industry proved vitally important to reestablish an important food staple and also the jobs for those directly and indirectly involved in the fishing industry. In fact, in Sicily, there was a 400% increase in the number of fish coming into Palermo under the newly established organization as compared to the same month of the preceding year when the fisheries were under Axis supervision. So this concludes my presentation. Thank you very much. I look forward to any questions and also continuing to learn from my fellow panelists. Thank you very much.